I mean, look at him. Look at him, he's so cute. Little duckling. First real livestock on Goldshaw Farm.
So I don't think I have ever told you the story of how I got my first batch of ducks. If you were a farm OG and you go back with us about 7 years ago, you might know the story. But the odds are you're not, because back then there were like 10 people watching and probably 8 of those people were related to either me or my wife. Whew. It was a cold and windy one today. All right, come on, guys. So let me take you back to a time on the farm, back to the spring of 2018. There was no Toby dog, there was no Abby dog, there was no Ginny barn cat, there were no ducks, geese, goats, chickens, cattle. There was nothing. The only animal on our farm at that time even was Pablo barn cat. But for me personally, that was like a really important spring. Because back in the fall of 2017, my wife Allison had left Washington, DC, where we'd both been living, and she moved to this old farmhouse here in Vermont. And I was still living and working in Washington, DC. I was desperately trying to find a job somewhere in New England that would let me relocate. And it was in the spring of 2018 that I landed a job at a local life insurance company here in Vermont, and I was able to quit life in DC and move up here full time. Part of why I was so excited to move to the farm full time was because I knew as soon as I had moved to the farm, that would be the time that I could get my first animals. You know, we bought the farm in 2016. We spent a big chunk of 2016 and 2017 fixing the farm up and doing like a lot of home renovations essentially. And also in 2017 was when I planted all of the trees in our permaculture orchard. And when you live in Washington, DC, but your farm's in Vermont and you have a nearly 600-mile commute to make to go from where you live to where you farm, you can manage having something like trees, but trying to have animals on the farm is just definitely a prospect you should not ever consider. And while I didn't know much, I knew that. And so that's why I opted to wait. And once I got that new job in Vermont, that's when I got my green light to get my animals. Now, these would be the first farm animals I would ever have. I have never in my life lived with chickens or ducks or geese or goats or pigs or sheep or cattle or really any farm animal whatsoever. I had grown up in the suburbs of Connecticut, and that meant that, you know, we really only ever had dogs or cats or maybe the occasional gerbil or goldfish, but we'd never had farm animals. And my entire adult life, really from the start of college onward, I never had any animals to take care of. And Pablo barn cat's addition to the farm really was the first animal I'd ever owned, even though Allison was living here at the time, and so it was really more her cat than my cat, which remains true today. As you guys know, I am not a cat person. And so I felt like I had a major decision on my hands when I decided to get those first animals on the farm once I knew I was moving up. And so that's why the first choice of animal on the farm was such a big decision, because it was like really gonna be my first choice of animal ever. And I had no experience with any animals whatsoever. Now, the conventional wisdom I have always been given is that you should always start with poultry. And even though I was always kind of thick-headed when it came to good advice, that was some advice that I took, and it made sense to me and it's logical. And even to this day, for anybody who's watching this video, just know that my advice remains very much there too. If you ever want to start with animals on a farm or a homestead, always start with poultry. My preferences would be either ducks or chickens. I went with the unconventional choice of ducks because for me, as I was thinking about my farm business, ducks were gonna be an important part of my business strategy. When I looked around here, particularly in northern Vermont, but also pretty much anywhere, what I always saw was the fact that there were people who had backyard eggs to sale, and they would sell those backyard eggs for really only a couple of bucks. And so it wasn't like you could charge a premium for chicken eggs back then. I think our inflationary times have made things a little bit different now, but back then you couldn't charge nearly that much money. I started to think about ducks because I thought ducks could potentially be a unique novelty that I could charge a premium price for. My earliest thinking was actually, I dreamed of one day becoming like the duck mogul of New England and supplying as many duck eggs as I had to various consumers in New England, particularly folks in like the Boston area or the Portland, Maine area, or in like the Connecticut suburbs where I grew up. Like those places are a couple of hours away, but there's a lot more people and a lot more money there. And so that's why the idea of ducks made sense from that standpoint. And when I looked out there in the landscape, there were a lot of people out there giving advice about ducks. And then on top of that, I have always been a big believer in the idea that it is better to be different than it is to be better. Being kind of unique and having a very distinct product that nobody else was really offering in the area, that also made sense for me. And so that's what got me down the research rabbit hole of ducks in the spring of 2018. Now, back then, there wasn't as many resources for duck education as there is now, but there were two YouTubers in particular that I really focused in on. One was a guy by the name of Matt who had a channel called 50 Ducks in a Hot Tub. And this guy just had ducks everywhere and was always hatching ducks. And like, he just had a pretty extreme duck operation, like the biggest one I'd ever seen. And so I enjoyed just watching his videos and seeing how his farm worked. And so watching those videos gave me an idea of how potentially my duck farm could be. The other one was a podcaster by the name of Jack Spirko. And Jack had a farm down in Texas, and he raised ducks for profit and even sold his duck eggs. And he made this series of videos on YouTube called the Duck Chronicles, where he would just have these daily diaries of raising his ducks, particularly when you get like a new batch of ducklings. And so watching that was also really formative for me in terms of how to think about my farm and think about raising ducks. And in fact, one of the catchphrases that my farm is most known for even still is that when I'd lock my ducks up at night, I would chant, "All ducks go to bed." Well, I actually stole that from Jack because he was the one who I first saw doing that.
All ducks, go to bed. All ducks, go to bed.
And I even had a chance when I was on his podcast several years later to recognize that. And it was just kind of cool to see how things went full circle like that. So I was in this researching rabbit hole and I was constantly watching YouTube videos to like help teach me about ducks. And I bought a couple of books about ducks, but those weren't nearly as engaging or instructional for me personally as those YouTube videos were. And so I decided, yes, I'm gonna get ducks. And since I was going to get ducks, it seemed like the spring would be the perfect time to do it. And I decided to go with 40 ducks because number one, I was gonna raise my ducks as a straight run, meaning the hatchery was gonna send me pretty much half male and half female. And that meant that I was going to need to figure out a way to butcher half the ducks when they got of age and probably either eat or sell those for meat. And then the remainder of the birds would become my laying flock. And I felt like 20 laying birds was like the bare minimum I could do to be able to start selling duck eggs the following year. Now, when it comes time to order ducks, you're gonna find that there's a whole wide variety of ducks and they have different characteristics.
Release the Kraken!
There's the Muscovy duck, which is kind of rugged, and if there's any duck that's like super free range capable, I would argue that the Muscovy is the best in class for that. There are the hysterical and upright runner ducks who look like little bowling pins on webbed feet and are just adorable and funny and outstanding at free ranging and catching insects and eating weeds. There is the big gigantic Pekin duck, which is a breed that's primarily raised for meat, and they are exceptionally docile and slow and friendly, but they also have a propensity to eat themselves to death. And then there's also the khaki Campbell duck. The khaki Campbell duck traditionally being one of the most prolific layers, and particularly given my goal of wanting to have a duck egg business, it seemed to make the most sense that I should go with the best layer. And so I ended up ordering 40 khaki Campbell ducks online back in April. And I set the date for early June because that felt like just about the earliest possible time I'd want to get ducklings on the farm. I put in my order and I waited and I was all excited and I kept doing all the research and I kept having plans. and I even moved up to the farm, and I even started making YouTube videos. The reason I made YouTube videos also factored into my thinking around the farm business. You know, as I learned about other duck farmers through YouTube, I thought, wow, YouTube could be a great platform for people to find me and could potentially become customers for my duck eggs. And so I decided to just start documenting my experiences of moving up to the farm and getting people introduced to the farm and everything we've got going on, so that when I had duck eggs ready to sell, I'd have customers interested in buying them. I was hoping to get the ducklings delivered to the farm last week, but at the last minute, I got a note from the hatchery saying that they were going to be delayed and I wouldn't get them till this week. They said that they were going to be shipping out on a Tuesday. I just got this email though from the hatchery saying that they're going to show up sometime between Tuesday and Thursday. That is a wider delivery window than I had hoped. Now, as I waited for those ducks to arrive, I started with the basics. I took an old milk cooler room in our old 3-story dairy barn, and I lined the corners with hardware cloth so rats or weasels couldn't sneak in. And I built a little brooder where I would be able to house all of my little ducklings. And I figured out where to get heating lamps from and little waterers. And I watched all these videos to learn the tips and tricks of how I should be feeding and watering them and doing all of the research that way. And so I got the notification that they were gonna come, and I got all nervous because they didn't come immediately, and seemed like it was taking longer than it should, and it was like 2 days of transit for the ducklings, and I was terrified that they wouldn't be okay.
So now it is Wednesday morning, and I'm still waiting on the ducklings.
And I was like recording little video updates because I wanted to vlog the whole thing, and I didn't want to like miss a moment, and I wanted to capture everything. And looking back on it all, when I ask why was I like that, I think it was just because I was so excited about this new first step in our farm, and I wanted to just share with everybody what was happening. I wanted to share with friends and family back in cities that I had long since left. I wanted to share with my new friends here in Vermont. I just wanted everybody to know about my experience with the ducks. I think I had like 12 subscribers at the time. And so even though I was posting videos on YouTube, people on YouTube were not watching those videos. In fact, you can kind of go back to my video library if you're ever curious, and you can sort your videos to like oldest first, and you'll find some of those earliest awkward, uncomfortable YouTube videos, which were essentially me practicing and learning how to make videos, as well as practicing and learning how to farm. But then finally, 3 days after they shipped, I got a nice call from the folks at my local Peacham post office.
Guess what, guys? I just got a phone call from the post office here in Peacham. The ducklings are arrived. I'm going to pick them up right now.
And so I drove 5 minutes down the road from the farm to the post office, and I was greeted with 2 cardboard boxes that were peeping and squeaking and had all sorts of activity and liveliness to them, but I didn't dare open them up because I was terrified of getting them cold. I rushed back to the farm and brought the boxes of birds into my brooder, and I opened them up slowly and began to one by one take each little duckling out and dunk its head in water so it would learn how to drink, which I've since learned is completely unnecessary and overkill. And I would set it in the brooder, and I would add another one and another one and another one. And eventually I had unveiled 42 ducklings into this little brooder. Now, typically when you order from a hatchery, especially if you have a larger order, they're gonna throw in a bonus bird or 2 for you. That's usually just to compensate in case like one of them dies in shipping. And so I ended up with 42 ducklings. They were all alive, and I think 41 of those 42 looked healthy. And even that first week, I didn't lose a single duckling, and I was so excited, and everybody was just doing great. And I was making daily video updates, and it was amazing to just watch the ducks' progress, to watch them grow, to watch them go from these tiny little things that were so helpless to these little brown balls of energy who were just sprinting all over the place in the brooder and were making messes with water and just seemed to have so much life and joie de vivre. Like, it was incredible. And the more time I spent with the ducks, the more excited I was with the farm. I had actually a secret underlying fear that I would actually get bored with things pretty quickly. But the reality is, the experience of being a nurturer and a caretaker unlocked something in my personality that until that point in my life, I don't think I ever had really experienced. But nurturing and taking care of creatures, that action and those experiences and doing that work like spoke to this part of my soul that I had never really accessed before. And to this day, being able to take care of animals is like one of my greatest joys. And it was not something I even recognized in full until that first morning that I was opening up that cardboard box of ducklings. Now, the first few weeks of having the ducklings went well without a single hitch. They grew up, they were starting to almost outgrow their brooder, and pretty much when they were at the point of almost outgrowing their brooder, built a chicken tractor, which is a structure that's often used to keep chickens or even other birds out on pasture. It's like a cage that's easy to move, essentially, that has an open bottom floor. This allows the birds to have access to the ground. They can eat insects, they can eat the grass, they can eat the weeds, their poop gets all over the ground, and then you take that chicken tractor and you move it to a new spot every single day, pretty much just one length of the chicken tractor. The chicken tractor I built was designed by a guy named John Siskovich. He was a regenerative farmer down in Connecticut. He had a podcast, he made YouTube videos, and he was one of those other people that I was learning a lot from in my earliest days of farming research rabbit holes. He was just simply a parasocial relationship back then, but these days I actually count him as a friend. And the chicken tractor that John designed is really revolutionary. And if anybody's out there ever thinking about what sort of chicken tractor they should build for any of their birds, whether they be ducks or geese or chickens, which I guess is a novel concept to use chicken tractors for chickens, I recommend John's chicken tractor, even though it's a little bit more work than some of the other models that are out there. What's really nice is, number one, John has actually written incredible instructions that explain how to build one of those chicken tractors. And then the second thing is, I find them to be the most versatile type of chicken tractor, in that I have used them for ducks, geese, chickens over the years. I've used them for meat birds. I've used them for egg layers. I put nesting boxes and roosts in them before. When I have animals that are sick, I'll still to this day use them as hospital pens. They're durable. They last a really long time. And so while it's a little bit more of a build investment, I think they are a much better solution versus some of the smaller chicken tractors, like the ones that you can't even walk in. I actually find those to be kind of a pain in the neck and not all that useful. I moved my ducklings who were starting to grow their feathers outside and was hoping for the best when, I don't know, it was probably a few days after moving them out. It was on the 4th of July, I discovered. I've got kind of a bummer of a duck update for you today. It's about 8:30 tonight. I just came in to do my check on the birds for the evening and refill their water. And I discovered this guy right here, just kind of dead like this. I don't even know why. Everybody else looks okay. They have plenty of food, plenty of water, but he's just dead. This is the first bird we've lost. I guess this is the downside and dark side of raising animals, is that, yeah, death is a part of it. Just like you have life, 40 lives over there, you got one dead here. I did the best I could, but doesn't make it any less of a bummer. I didn't even know why, but it was just face down on the ground, kind of near the waterers. It hadn't been attacked, it hadn't been trampled, it was just dead. And I was kind of heartbroken. Like, that was the first animal I ever lost on the farm, and I felt sad. But I had been doing enough research to know that if you have livestock, oftentimes you will have dead stock, and that death was a part of life. And the fact that I hadn't lost a bird yet and I had been so lucky, I felt like I was just kind of statistically due, and I was ready to just be comfortable with that and keep moving forward. But over the next few days, I had several more ducks get sick and die, and I had no reason why. I was doing research online, and whenever you go online and go into chicken forums or duck forums or on Facebook group or like backyard bird websites that look like they're from 2004, like, it's a behavior that's almost as bad as, like, if you don't feel all that good and you just start Googling your symptoms and looking on WebMD, like, people will just throw out the most randomest stuff. And so I was wondering, were my birds sick with botulism? Did they have wry neck? Was this a problem with some sort of bloodborne parasite? Did they get enough niacin? Were they too cold? Like, there were all of these possibilities of things that I could have been screwing up, and I had no idea what I was actually screwing up. And meanwhile, more birds were getting sick and more birds were dying. I even tried to do like a necropsy, even though I had no idea what the heck I was doing. I'm not seeing anything, which scares the heck out of me. And it was just really heartbreaking.
I think there's probably 2 or 3 in there that don't look good either. I really hope I don't have too many more losses in the flock. This is bad. I'm really worried.
And it took about a week to get through it all. And by the time things were done, I had lost 13 ducks. And I just was heartbroken. And I didn't even know why. Now, looking back on things now, as I've become a much more experienced duck owner and raiser and working with them, I think my problem was probably that I was not giving them enough niacin. Back then, I would just simply use chicken feed to feed my ducklings. And I heard from people that you could like buy niacin at a nutrition store and just sprinkle it on their food and that would be enough and fine. That does in fact work. You know, other options that are probably cheaper than like medical niacin would also be brewer's yeast or nutritional yeast, which you can buy at like supply stores or grocery stores. The thing though that I actually prefer to do now more than anything else is I will typically buy commercial duck feed at the feed stores. It wasn't nearly as available back then as it is now, but it has become my go-to. And even though it might not have quite as much protein as if you used like chick starter that you get at the store, one of the things I have found is that the niacin level is perfectly balanced, and I've never had a problem with ensuring that a bird gets enough niacin, which is a nutrient that if a bird's living out on pasture and free ranging, and it's with its mom, it's gonna get it naturally. But if you have it living inside of a brooder, and if you're just starting to raise it inside of a chicken tractor, it's just probably not getting enough niacin. And while they need them in those first couple of weeks of life, you probably don't see a ton of problems until probably like weeks 3, 4, 5. That's when I've always seen problems with niacin deficiencies with birds, ducks specifically. But hindsight is 20/20, and when you raise animals on a farm for the first time, sometimes you're gonna have those hard lessons learned. And sometimes those hard lessons learned actually mean death for living creatures. And that is a dilemma that even still to this day I struggle with and haven't even quite made peace with it. But if you're ever considering trying to raise animals on a farm or a homestead, just know that you're gonna probably fall into that category, even if you try your hardest, even if you do as much research as possible, even if you get advice from friends, like you're probably gonna still screw something up. I know it probably feels weird to say it's okay, but you know what, you guys? It is okay. It is a part of the process. It is a part of learning. It is a part of growing. Whether it be you're working on a farm or just in other phases of life, people make mistakes. They make mistakes that they probably shouldn't have even made. But the real important thing is how they learn from those mistakes, how they recover from those mistakes, and how they keep going from those mistakes. And for me, it was a tough couple of weeks when I was losing those birds. But over the coming months, my farming abilities grew. You know, I'd go out there every morning and move the chicken tractor or duck tractor, and I taught my ducks to go into the house by themselves each night. All I had to do was walk around and tell them all ducks go to bed, and just like Jack Spirko, they'd go into their coop. And that was just one glorious summer that, as I tell you this story now, I look back on it so fondly. Like, you know, it's just like I'm so full of nostalgia for that time. I think things are better now. I'm very happy with my life now. But there is some sort of beautiful simplicity for when, back in the day, the farm basically consisted of myself, Pablo Barncat, who you see walking across the desk here, and Lil Barncat, who is our house cat now inside the house. Those 29 ducks. Now, by the time the winter rolled around and I had retrofitted a shed to become a winter house for the ducks, I was ready to actually do my first duck butchering. And at the time, I had never actually butchered a bird by myself. I had seen a couple of other people do butchering, and I had watched videos and I had read books. But this was gonna be my first time. And now, one of the hardest things about butchering waterfowl, both ducks and geese, is the fact that they are waterproof. And their waterproofness makes getting their feathers out after you've killed them really, really difficult. You know, typically when people are harvesting chickens or turkeys, they will use a device known as a chicken plucker, which typically looks like a washing machine with like these nubby rubber fingers, and the device will spin the bird around and the fingers will rub against their feathers. And if you just take a chicken and dunk it into some hot water and you just scald it a couple of times, you can then take that bird, toss it in the plucker, spin it around, and in about 60 seconds, you're going to have a naked bird. Now with ducks, it's not that easy. With ducks, because of their waterproof feathers, you actually have to figure out another way. On the internet, I've seen people give the advice that you can use Dawn soap and that will help break through the oils in their feathers and help make the scald work. I'm here to tell you that it helps a tiny bit, but it is not a solution. And after doing this several years now, both ducks and geese, I can tell you with certainty that waxing a bird, much like you're giving somebody a bikini wax, is the best way. And so typically the process today when we're harvesting a duck here on the farm is we will scald the bird in hot water, run it through a chicken plucker, then basically do a second scald and pluck to get a lot of the feathers off. But then to get a nice clean and naked bird, we will take that same bird that's been plucked now twice and dip it in some hot wax, dip that hot wax in cold water. That allows for the hot wax to solidify. And then we'll go in there and rip off the hard pieces of wax, and that will pluck the feathers. Like I said, like a bikini wax. But that first day of harvesting ducks on the farm, we were not that good. I had recruited a few of my friends like Leslie and Nick and Jeff and Leslie's father, and we worked together for hours to kill the birds, which was really hard and really sad. But once I'd figured out how to quickly decapitate them and then bleed them out, I found that it was relatively simple, and I felt like I was giving them the quickest and fastest end to life and trying to live up to a promise of giving those animals only one bad day on the farm. But the plucking was really hard, and we tried scalding multiple times. We tried ratcheting up the heat on the scalder, but that just made the skin rip. And as we worked and worked on it, it was so difficult and it was so brutal that by the end of it, I seriously was considering giving up duck farming that afternoon. But through determination and use of needle nose pliers, we were able to get the birds plucked. I gave some to friends, particularly the friends who helped me do the butchering, as well as I sold a few of them, and that's actually how we turned our first profit on the farm that very first year. It was only a couple $100s. I could go back and look and see what it was, but it was meager, but it was not a loss, and I felt really good about that. Now, one of the questions I so frequently get when I talk about raising animals, and particularly when I talk about butchering animals for meat that I have raised, people will often ask, is it hard? And the truth of the matter is, it is. It's not easy. And I think if anybody's cavalier and says that, it doesn't matter, they're just, meat pods that are, sentient for a moment, I think they're actually either one, not as in touch with their feelings as they should be, or two, they lack the empathy for the living creature. To this day, I find butchering day to be a very mixed blessing. On one level, it is kind of nice to have fewer animals afterwards, and usually by the time your animals are ready to be butchered, they can often be a handful, and so in some ways you won't miss them in that regard. But on the other hand, yeah, it's hard. I mean, these are animals that were either born on your farm or they usually showed up on your farm at like a day or two old. And so you have known them their entire lives. And to have to be the one to dispatch them, it puts some weight on your soul. I will say it gets easier as you get practice with it. I will also say as you realize the negative impact that comes from raising animals and not being comfortable with butchering, is also, I think, worse than actually the butchering itself. Because as I've traveled all around the country talking about ducks, I have seen duck flocks where it's like 3/4 drakes and all of the females are getting picked over and beaten down mercilessly. You can just see how unhappy their flocks are because the ratio of birds isn't being maintained. Or I've seen owners of animals and even helped owners of animals who couldn't quite bring themselves to dispatch their own animals. I have seen them let their animals suffer because they couldn't get comfortable with the idea of letting their hand be the one to put it down. And meanwhile, many of these same people who are uncomfortable with butchering, or even the people who don't have animals but hear me tell stories about butchering my animals, and they look at me like I'm some barbaric savage, but then at the very same time, they're perfectly comfortable with going to a McDonald's or going to the grocery store and purchasing a styrofoam pack of pink meat orbs that are branded as boneless, skinless chicken breasts. And I will say that knowing that most of the meat I eat actually comes from our farm and I played some sort of role in dispatching it, and know that I did my very best to ensure that that animal lived in a humane way and it died in a humane way. That to me is a really important decision, and I don't feel like it's always right to outsource the ugly part of the job just because you don't like it. There's other uglier parts of the job where it's just like hard physical work that isn't fun, that make me much more comfortable with outsourcing, but I don't shy away from the process these days because of any sort of moral or ethical dilemma. And to this day, I still, if I have a bird that needs to be dispatched on the spot, I will, and I've gotten very comfortable with that role I have to play here on the farm. And for anyone who is considering having animals, I would really strongly caution you against getting animals unless you have somebody in your household who's willing to do that dispatch work if necessary. I think it's actually part of the process of being a humane owner. And now as I sit here in this barn with this barn cat in front of me telling you this story, it's been 7 seasons of farming that I've gone through, and I still feel like I have so much more to learn. But I do feel like I've also gotten past the pure beginner stage that I was that first year I was raising ducks. And I will tell you too, getting comfortable with the mistakes you make that first time you raise animals is arguably one of the most important parts of being ready to raise animals. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Look back on things. If you like it, I might do another one real soon. And if you're curious, I'll leave probably a playlist of some old videos there, and I'll leave some new stuff down there. And thanks for watching, everybody.